I know you got questions, but we gotta get moving.
The Rage games are a strange beast. The first game came out at a time when first-person shooters had moved to mostly cover-based modern military shooters, veering toward realism and cinematic action set-pieces in the early 2010s, in very much the same way FPSs had veered towards being story-based in the early 2000s. Despite some great ideas, Rage 1 underperformed in sales and seemed to leave very little in the way of cultural impact. Unfortunately, while Rage 2 improved in some aspects of its predecessor, it regressed on others. Where the original game had been made solely by id Software, Rage 2 was developed by Avalanche Studios in their Apex engine, with id's team acting mostly in the advisory role while they worked on Doom Eternal. I hate to be cliché and say that Rage 2 feels like a game split between two companies, but I'm gonna do it anyway. In order to get into that, however, I will need to detail some of the finer points of Rage 1 first. I've always been a huge fan of Rage 1. When I captured this footage, it was my 4th playthrough overall, with my first 3 being on the Xbox 360. I am, however, certainly willing to acknowledge its flaws. First off is the critique that the game's two main mechanics felt disconnected from one another. That is, the shooting and the driving. Whilst I think the driving is passable, the way the car is used felt out of place both in the forced races and the car combat. Enemy vehicles in Rage 1 often harass you en route from hub to mission areas and back again. However, whereas most of these routes are tight outdoor doors, the combat sections usually open up into Dust Bowl arenas, where you'll often have to drive around in circles in order to fight the enemy. This is because the turrets in your car only lock on if the enemy is roughly in front of you, so the player must stop their main task, getting to the mission, to start a separate task, fighting cars. You could of course speed past the enemy vehicle, but that's not ideal either. If your players are encouraged to avoid engaging with a certain aspect of your games, then that is a flaw in the game design. Car combat in Rage 1 ends up feeling more like Twisted Metal or Vigilante 8. Both of these are great games, but their fighting takes place in arenas and the combat is all about lining yourself up to do damage with weapons that mostly fire in a straight line, laying traps like mines, or finding the more powerful pickups that locked on and homed in. On top of that, of course, these games were meant to be driving games, so there's no dissonance here, you aren't stopping one game to play another. The next criticism often levelled at Rage 1 is that it reuses levels. This is another fair point, though if I'm talking from a purely personal perspective, I think that this is a minor issue that has clearly been caused by budget or time constraints. That does not in any way mean that players can't criticise repetition, but I do think it's unfair to frame it as lazy or malicious, with the exception of course being asset flip Steam games. The final criticism is often levelled at the dull story, and on this point I have mixed views. For most of the game you aren't entirely sure what the plot is going to be about, and most of the characters are likeable enough that the player will find themselves drawn into the world. In the early game, Rage 1 benefits from the J.J. Abrams mystery box approach to storytelling. The idea of the mystery box being that the quickest way to pull someone into a story is to feed them just enough information to suggest that there are answers out there somewhere, but to withhold that information for as long as possible, thus keeping the mystery box alive. For Mr. Abrams, this has obviously had mixed results. The primary mystery box in Rage is the Authority, with the second box being the origins of the mutants. The Authority serve as the obligatory remnants of the old world government that is found in every post-apocalyptic story. All the player knows is that the Authority are looking for anyone that is woken up from an arc, because their arc suit makes them a considerable threat to the Authority and its goons. As is often the problem with mystery boxes, once they are opened and the questions are answered, all interest and intrigue is gone. For the Authority, the issue is that they have no clear goals beyond dominance over the wasteland. And for the mutants, much to no one's surprise, the answer to their mystery is that they were created by the Authority, who were trying to make super soldiers. Because it's always bloody super soldiers. Not long after this second reveal, the game somewhat rushes the player towards the final mission. I remember the first time I played this game I thought the finality was bad, but honestly I now think it's just unsatisfying. The idea is sound. Your final mission is to infiltrate the Authority base and enter the code that will release the remaining arcs, freeing the arc suit wearers within, recruiting them into the Resistance. However, the mission itself is incredibly short and made a lot easier since you're given this massive F-off gun which has BFG rounds as one of its ammo types. When you reach the climax of the level and hit the big win the day button, the entire game ends within 30 seconds, most of which is cutscene with absolutely no dialogue, leaving players underwhelmed and somewhat shortchanged. From the promotional campaign to the art design, it is clear that someone in the marketing department wanted Rage 2 to rise above the idea that Rage 1 was just another muddy brown early 2010s shooter. Unfortunately, they did this in such a slapdash manner that it becomes jarring rather than endearing. You have wacky zany goons dressed up like London punks in the 70s, a colour palette with accents of neon pink everywhere, which is apparently the only paint colour that survives the apocalypse, and weird character introductions that feel like they may have been a holdover from an earlier build of the game. Either that or these elements were rushed in the last minute because the main bulk of the game wasn't exciting enough. Neither scenario would surprise me considering all of the aforementioned is set alongside a story that plays itself painfully straight. Main quest givers with zero personality and side quest givers who literally just stand against the wall barely emoting as they intone the criteria for their mission. I don't expect the game to be like Borderlands, but at least Borderlands has a consistency across art style, play style, dialogue and characterization, even if that consistency is consistently insufferable. It's difficult to overview the Rage 2 story in the way I did for Rage 1 because there's significantly less to say, but I'll have a go anyway. So there's a guy called General Angry, who's basically Mecha Hitler if Mecha Hitler was designed by Mazda instead of Volkswagen. The game starts with the Authority invading your base and killing some characters you don't have any time to care about. As luck would have it, just after the intro you're told about something called Project Dagger, which just so happens to be a plan to stop the Authority. And literally nothing ever gets in your way. I mean, from here to the final boss fight, there are zero setbacks, no threat, no suspense. If I had to guess, a player could ignore all the open world content and speed through the story in around 3 to 5 hours. Just to give a few examples of how low the stakes are in this story. At one point you enter a base. These bases all look the same by the way, which is one of the downsides of having a fully open world. And when you get to the end of this base you come face to face with General Mift. But you've just seen his body suspended in a chamber. So the player's immediate thought is, oh, that must be a clone, so this boss fight will have no consequences because his clone will just leave and I'll fight him at the end of the game. And the player is exactly right. At the end of the game he comes in riding Chekhov's mutant.
I realised in my final read-through before recording that I cut out the part earlier in the script where I showed this mutant actually hanging in a separate base, but I felt so tickled by the Chekhov's mutant joke that I kept it in. It's important to remember that I'm a very smart boy and I've read literally tens of books.
After General Store is killed, we're treated to the same issue in Rage 1, a rushed ending. From the moment you stab a nanotrite needle in his eye to the credit roll is again about 30 seconds. There is also an after credit scene, but that is just to put the player back in the world and show that this guy, Dr. Kvasir, can't be trusted. Though to be fair to the Doctor, being treacherous makes him the only character in the game with at least one personality trait. I don't want to go into too much detail in the ending because ultimately Rage 2 could have been a good game with a mediocre story. A decent story however would have taken the game's other issues out of focus. Instead, the story and the gameplay both end up drawing attention to each other and themselves. In watching and reading interviews with the team on Rage 2, it's evident that even the team themselves were aware of the story's issues. I can find at least 2 instances, this article and this video, where Tim Willits, id Software's creative director, said that playing the story is not the main way to enjoy the game. Now, you could certainly argue that most open world games are not supposed to be played in a way that ignores all side content to solely follow the main story. But at least with most of those games, the side content is some story involved or world building. Rage 2's side content, on the other hand, involves one of 2 things. Either attacking similar looking outposts that have very slight differences in order to make a bar go up that is linked to one of the 3 main quest givers, or carrying out side missions. And when I say side missions, I mean something more akin to the perpetual tertiary missions from Skyrim, where the player is asked to visit a tomb they've visited 7 times already to kill some bandits. As regards the aforementioned quest giver progress bars, that brings me quite neatly to talk about the game's somewhat convoluted upgrade system.
Security scanning complete. Welcome to ARC 416A.
Rage 2 wants the player to be far more aggressive in their combat than its predecessor. Right at the start of the game you're given a dash ability that not only allows you to circle strafe enemies faster and dodge grenades, but will also briefly confuse enemies throwing off their aim. After this you're let loose into the open world, but I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that most players eager to receive new abilities will make a beeline for the nearest arc. Players just been informed will grant them new weapons and abilities. When you get to this nearest arc you'll be granted the second ability and one of the game's most useful, Shatter, which knocks armor off armored enemies and obliterates the smaller enemies. From here the Wasteland has 5 more abilities and 6 more weapons for the player to discover, the majority of which are outside the main plot. While Rage 1 kept its upgrades to either key missions or optional items that could be bought in shops, such as weapon mods or increased armor, Rage 2 chooses to use the RPG light approach used in most shooters since Far Cry 3. In principle this is fine enough, although I do feel its overuse compounds the idea that it's somehow a necessary system, and often puts the developer in a situation where they are underpowering the player at the beginning of the game, withholding abilities that should be standard in order to create a false sense of progress, and then overpowering them at the end of the game if they unlock every upgrade. This means that the middle of the game with around half the upgrade tree unlocked is the time when the player feels most balanced and the most fairly challenged by enemies. Many of the upgrades available in Rage 2 are to be expected, such as decreased cooldowns or wider area of effect on certain abilities. Others feel like the kind of abilities that, as I just said, should be default and have only been removed to justify several tiers to the upgrade system, such as the ability to run while reloading or the ability to melee grenades back at enemies. Further abilities are not necessarily unwelcome, just highly unusual, such as the upgrade that means switching away from a weapon for more than 10 seconds will automatically reload the weapon. Which, okay, I guess, which really feels like they're scraping the barrel with some of these, and once you see the menu it will become clear why. Most games with these systems would have 1 or maybe even 2 upgrade trees at the most, but Rage has 4 or possibly 6 depending on how you count them. Let's start with how the player goes about upgrading abilities. First you go to a submenu named Nanotraits, as your skills are granted by nanotechnology. From here you highlight a skill, and in my case as a PC player, hold F to upgrade it. However, you can also press the Enter key to see a perk menu, most of which are the aforementioned decreased cooldowns, increased AoE, etc, etc. The ability itself is upgraded with Feltrite, but the perks are bought with Nanotrite boosters. Then there's a weapons submenu. From this menu the player must press Enter to view gun upgrades with the same process, hold F to upgrade a gun using Feltrite, or press Enter again to add new perks which require weapon mods. After this there is another submenu called Projects. There are 3 main NPC characters who must have missions for you in Rage 2, Hagar, Dr. Cavassier and John Marshall. These are also the 3 characters who orchestrate the aforementioned Project Dagger. Each of these characters has a project that unlocks after you do the first mission for their respective NPC. As you're out and about in the world you come across all manner of your typical open world fare. Enemy bases, fuel depots, arc pods, authority sentry towers, etc, etc. Destroying these or killing enemies nearby will give you some project points and level up your favour with one of the 3 NPCs, depending on the type of task you completed. From these separate projects you can receive yet more perks. To clarify what I mean when I say that each of these NPCs has a project, I mean they each have a separate upgrade tree found in the project submenu, which also contains a 4th upgrade tree from your sister what's her name. Next up is the vehicle submenu, basically the same idea as weapons except vehicles are only upgraded with vehicle parts, not Feltrite. Finally there are upgrades that can be granted by a character called the Cyberdoc. These upgrades can be applied to health, overdrive and weapon damage. Each one of these upgrades requires 1 Arctech core, 1 mutant gland, and 1 neuronic interface. There seems to be no limit to how many times you can purchase these upgrades, and each one increases the effectiveness of their respective category by 5%. So, as you can see there are an abundance of different upgrade points throughout the game, some of which are supplemented by Feltrite, some are not. The thing is, if you actually asked me to describe specifically what is wrong with this, I couldn't tell you. It's not like there's a rule in video games that there must only be 1 or 2 types of upgrade points, but it does make the menus feel convoluted, make upgrading a hassle, and generally seem like an unnecessary amount of hoop jumping to go through every time the player wants to make their ranger and the ranger's equipment more viable. It also means that at a certain point in the game, Feltrite becomes almost useless because it is only used to upgrade nanotrites or weapons. There's a point where the player can be around 50% map completion, still picking up Feltrite, but it can't be used for upgrading your vehicle and has no effect on projects. I can see why the developers would try to implement a skill tree and multiple upgrade options, since they clearly want players to explore the world rather than focus on the main mission. But at the same time they still want the players to have a sense of progression. This idea unfortunately falls apart when the world map itself is quite boring to explore. Like everything else in the game, the open world is a balance of good and bad. There isn't much going on in the wasteland story-wise, instead the world consists of a series of symbols to check off a map. As a side note, this approach to the open world has been brilliantly parodied in a free-to-play Steam game called Open World Game, The Open World Game, but that's not within the scope of this video. I'm not completely against the Ubisoft open world model. I really enjoyed the early Assassin's Creed games and still enjoy Far Cry 3, but its ubiquitousness feels like something of a vicious circle. By that I mean almost every open world game follows the Ubisoft model. Some of them sell well because some of them are genuinely good games, but then marketing teams and publishers think that the model is what people want just because some of the games sold well, so they force it into their game whether it fits or not. Avalanche Studios, who did the majority of the work on Rage 2, had also previously made the Mad Max game in 2015. In his 2015 video on Mad Max, YouTuber Noah Caldwell-Gervais made an interesting point about what that game was trying to achieve. He brought up a conversation from Mad Max Road Warrior, in which a character named Gallo asks Max why he just drives about the empty wastes feeding off the scraps of the old world, and doesn't take much interest in the new one. Noah uses this conversation as part of his defense of the game. The game is made from Max's point of view, travelling the wasteland, trying to survive, living off scraps of the old world. Reviewers at the time mostly reviewed the Mad Max game from Gallo's perspective, decrying the endless driving and scavenging and refusing to engage in civilization. The massive open world in the Mad Max game makes sense because the driving and the scavenging and the endless slog of fighting are part of the feeling the game is going for. They're trying to make you feel like Mad Max. But I struggle to get a sense of the point of Rage 2's open world. The ranger character you play as may be on their own and may also have a car that evokes the Interceptor, but the similarities with Max I can't be bothered googling his second name end there. The Ranger's arsenal and abilities make living in the world more of an inconvenience than a struggle, and you certainly don't need to scavenge to survive, though resources for craftable items can be found or bought. On top of that, the player is presented with a world that isn't worth saving. Rage 1 had some wacky characters, but Rage 2 has outright caricatures of real humans. Practically every background NPC is either insane, drunk, or high, and none of these three archetypes is portrayed compassionately. Instead, the game quite often comes across as downright misanthropic, even by the standards of a post-apocalypse. So I don't think Rage 2's open world is necessarily meant to make the player feel like an archetype such as the lone wanderer or the reluctant hero. Instead, the open world seems to be used to give the player more options of how to play rather than just travelling from mission to mission, which was admittedly most of what the player had to do in Rage 1 unless they liked the races or Mutant Bash TV. It's possible, and I try not to be too cynical when reviewing, that the world is just there because it artificially extends the length of the game. As I said, this game has basically no setbacks in its story, and if it weren't for the long driving sections and limited fast travel, there wouldn't be much to it at all. On top of that, the world you drive through has no personality, and virtually nothing in the way of environmental storytelling outside of enemy encampments. There are several degrees of orangish yellow desert, canyons, a swamp, and a jungle. Each one of these areas looks like the kind of maps I used to make in Far Cry 3's map creator, in the sense that it looks hastily cobbled together by someone trying to remember, without references, what these biomes look like. Before I move on to the next section, I want to bring attention to one place I did find in this world that was interesting, which wasn't marked on the map. This house is filled with PA systems. I went all around this building multiple times and couldn't find a way in. I don't know if there's any extended lore about this house, whether it's just a place that goons come to party or maybe just somewhere owned by a person who really likes loud music. But suffice to say, this house does more to pique my curiosity and add character to the world than a dozen flashy boss intros or fluff-riddled cutscenes. There may very well be more moments like this in other areas of the game, but it's honestly hard to tell since the map makes exploration so uninteresting that the occasional piece of good environmental storytelling just isn't worth the effort. As I mentioned earlier, the main issues with vehicles in Rage 1 are too many forced races and that the car combat feels more like a chore than a fun and challenging part of travelling from point A to point B. Rage 2 almost completely reworks the car combat, and it is mostly to great effect. For one thing, the mouse or right thumbstick now controls the gun turret, giving the player a lot more control over who they shoot. The fighting also takes place on the road rather than in Dust Bowl arenas, which among other things allowed the developers to introduce a new sideswipe move that allows the players to smack enemies off the road, causing them to crash Burnout style, but without the instant replay. The format of the fights has changed as well. Whereas in Rage 1 you would face between 2 and 5 cars that mostly looked the same but had a big number over their head to indicate how much damage they could dish out and dish in, Rage 2's developers clearly watched Fury Road as most fights are against convoys. These convoys do come in different designs, but they mostly follow the same layout. Bikes that ride in pairs and can do this electrical thing, cars which travel at roughly the same speed as the player and have comparable weapons to their Phoenix, tanks drive slowly but can take serious chunks out of your vehicle's health, and then there's the lead vehicle of each convoy, an articulated multi-segmented behemoth that must be taken down one chunk at a time. There are certainly a lot of improvements here. This type of combat is more engaging, and the decision to keep the fight on narrow roads means that the combat doesn't make the player feel like they are stopping their journey to engage in a fight. Rather, the fight is part of the journey. It did take some time getting used to fighting multiple vehicles while paying attention to upcoming twists and turns in the road, especially since the Phoenix doesn't turn too well unless you liberally apply the handbrake. But once I got used to it, I found taking down the convoys to be genuinely engaging. If anything, I would go so far as to say that it's a shame there aren't more fights to be had on the roads. The convoys are quite spread out, and when not fighting them, the player will only occasionally come across other opportunities for vehicular combat, instead being resigned to what is often an uneventful slog from one mission to the other, unless that is you stop for a fight. From Rage 2's marketing, it's clear that whomsoever was in charge wanted to emphasise two things, the colour palette and the combat. I actually quite liked Rage 1's art style, but when it comes to combat, Rage 2 excels. The movement is as fluid as games like Overwatch or Apex Legends, and just like in these two games, Rage 2 players use movement to weave in and out of enemy projectiles, as well as using it to reposition and re-engage to take enemies by surprise. Whereas Rage 1 intended to take the rhythms of shooters from the time and expand upon them, Rage 2, following on from Doom and made in tandem with Doom Eternal, rejects these rhythms entirely, preferring instead to embrace the first-person shooter's arcadey past. Enemies explode into bits and innards, while a counter in the bottom left of the screen ticks over as more carnage is caused. This meter fills your overdrive, which does exactly what you think it would. And once overdrive is activated, chaining kills and using a variety of abilities and weapons will keep overdrive overdriving for longer. Much like the combat itself, the environments that fights take place in also blend old with new. They of course have the sense of place that a lot of older games lacked or were unable to provide, but they are still set up to complement the fast-paced action. With exploding everything and multiple levels of catwalks, containers, buildings and burnt out cars to weave in and out of or clamber onto. In fact, as a side note, if you do play this game, always use jumping and climbing to reach the high ground and avoid ladders like the plague. Seriously, this is a fast-paced shooter and you don't just press a button to attach to ladders, you hold a button to attach to ladders. Despite the many ways in which Rage 2 borrows from Doom 2016, it unfortunately doesn't necessitate switching weapons as much as its cousin title. For almost my entire playthrough I used the assault rifle, the shotgun and the rocket launcher. Most of the other weapons range from good to great, but because Rage 2 doesn't have the enemy variety or ammo scarcity of Doom, there's no real reason to switch weapons other than sheer curiosity. This contrasts with Rage 1, where there were moments in which it was not only essential to change weapons, but also change ammo type.
Dumb bastards didn't even have guns. You find anything yet? They're shitty.
In any given Rage 1 mission, it is common to need the crossbow for stealth or electrifying water, the sniper rifle for long-range shots on turret positions and other snipers, shotgun for close range, assault rifle for medium range, rocket launcher for bosses or crowds. Even craftable and throwable items such as frags, EMP grenades, the wing stick and turrets are far more necessary for the sake of crowd control, even at medium difficulty levels. There are some different enemy types in Rage 2, but not many. And the variety that is there doesn't affect combat as much as it did in the first game because the space has changed. In Rage 1, the strange movement of the ghosts, mutants and jackals meant that shooting them could prove a challenge, and their speed and acrobatics made fighting them in closed spaces tense even when you landed most of your shots. Back to Rage 2, the mutants still scramble and roll and even try to surround you, but the speed of your character, the power of your abilities, and the fact that ammo is far less scarce in the second installment all mean that they may as well have not kept the movement at all. It adds some character to the enemy's animations, but I doubt most players are standing still long enough to admire the way their enemy moves, and I certainly never felt anywhere near the same level of tension fighting them. This isn't to say that Rage 2 shouldn't have had enemy variety, it's that the enemy variety they chose added very little to combat. I don't want to presume, to suggest, to ponder, to imply that I know more about game design than literal professional designers, but if they perhaps had enemies that buff smaller grunts, or enemies that can affect your character's abilities like the Overseers in Dishonored, anything to mix up the combat and balance out the fact that the player has so much more space to move, with far more ways of moving through that space. This is one of the many strange aspects of playing these games back to back. Rage 1 may not have had better combat mechanics than Rage 2, but its style of combat fits in much better with the other mechanics such as crafting and scavenging. You are a one-man army in both games, sure, but in Rage 1 it is essential to explore the area for spare parts and think carefully about which items you want to craft. And one of the best trade-offs in this regard is the lock grinder. These will only ever be used to enter optional areas, but these optional areas will have stuff that can be used in combat, crafting or selling, and in one of the areas you'll even get a gun early on called the Authority machine gun, which normally costs quite a lot of money to obtain. But of course, crafting a lock grinder also uses components that can be sold or used in other parts such as grenades, turrets or spider bots. Money is even more important in Rage 1 too, since weapon upgrades and armor upgrades are bought rather than gained through spending one of the many ability points as with Rage 2. Meanwhile, scavenging in Rage 2 is almost pointless. There are still craftables such as grenades and wing sticks, and selling items for money can still be useful seeing as how certain upgrade points and improved crafting schematics can be bought from vendors. However, Rage 2's faster pace, the fact that enemies drop health pickups, the fact that levels and mission sites have an abundance of health and ammo pickups, and the fact that abilities have taken the place in combat that used to be occupied by throwables and turrets, means that it's quite rare these items are ever needed. Rage 2 certainly gives the player great feeling in its combat, and for some players that's enough. And I'm not going to sit here and tell people that there's a wrong way to enjoy a game because that just isn't true. But for me personally, I've wasted enough of my time over the years playing games I didn't enjoy that much just because a certain aspect of the gameplay, loot grinding or level progression give me a temporary buzz. I am of course looking directly at you, Destiny, you saucy little Skinnerbox. It's taken me some time to write the conclusion to this video. In fact, it was supposed to be published last month. On one hand, I have a lot of nostalgia for Rage 1, but I've only played Rage 2 once, so I've had to try and separate myself from my bias and be as fair as possible. But even with that, I can't help but feel that Rage 1 managed to be at least consistent in its mediocrity across most aspects of the gameplay and aesthetic. Rage 2, on the other hand, veers wildly from fast-paced gunplay to an open world that is a slog to drive through and depressing to existing. Rage 2 definitely feels like a game that has suffered development issues. I don't know whether it was budget or time frame, or there were perhaps last-minute reworks, but considering both these studios are incredibly talented, I highly doubt it was due to a lack of work ethic or understanding of what makes a game good. Part of me would like to see a third installment of the Rage series, just to see if the pros of both games can be combined into a coherent whole. But seeing as id Software are already doing gangbusters with the Doom franchise, and Bethesda are fans of money, I hardly doubt that will happen. As for Avalanche, I hope their next game goes well, because as a studio they've created so many interesting titles, but their success has always come in peaks and troughs. Thanks for watching.